Okay, let's think about this for a second. What if the most pivotal moments in history, the ones that brought down huge criminal empires or stopped major terror plots or even put down liberation movements, what if they weren't just about clever detectives or fancy tech? What if they hinged almost entirely on just one secret source, someone from the inside? Today, we're diving deep into that hidden world, the controversial, often really murky world of informants. These are the people who secretly feed information to authorities. And their role, well, it's been surprisingly central throughout history. We're talking over 200 years of secrets, spies, it's global, covering law enforcement, intelligence, you name it. And for many of you listening, especially those connected to communities that have really fought for self-determination, for justice, well, this whole story of informants carries a particular weight, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a fascinating topic, but also deeply paradoxical, isn't it? On one hand, informants are often absolutely crucial. You need them to get justice, sometimes to prevent terrible harm, maybe even win wars. But I mean, just by definition, what they do involve this profound betrayal. It's a secret life lived right at that crossroads of loyalty and deception. And what we've done for this deep dive is gather a ton of source material for you. We're talking hundreds of pages, articles, historical records, research, and we've specifically tailored it to pull out the most important stuff. We want to tell the full stories, especially the ones that really hit home for the history of movements and communities. Stories we know our listeners, particularly from places like Baraka Tabernacle and the Lion's Den Fam podcast, will find, well, compelling and vital.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack exactly how these informants get recruited, what sorts of things they're used for, and, how effective they actually are. Because sometimes they're incredibly effective, but that effectiveness often comes with huge controversies. We'll be getting into the details, sometimes pretty shocking stories of some key figures in this shadowy world. And to really get it, we need to go back, way back to the origins.
Indeed, we have to.
Because when we talk informants, it's easy to picture like modern spy movies, right? The James Bond stuff.
Yeah.
But relying on them goes back much further than any modern agency. It really came out of, well, just necessity, trying to stop threats.
Absolutely. Think about the early 19th century, the
Yeah.
American South. In 1822, South Carolina, there was this massive planned slave insurrection led by Denmark Vesey, ready to go. And this wasn't small. We're talking potentially thousands of enslaved people involved. But it got foiled literally on the eve of the scheduled outbreak. Why? Because an enslaved household servant, someone on the inside, warned the white authorities.
Is an
Right.
informant, just like that. One person.
One person's betrayal. It led straight to Vesey's arrest, his execution, and the whole potential revolt involving thousands was crushed before it even started. It's a really stark early example.
Yep.
Shows how one well-placed informant could just completely shut down a movement. That kind of disruptive power from an insider. It's a pattern you see again and again, especially in struggles for freedom.
And it wasn't just in the U.S., was it? What about places like the Caribbean?
Right. Look at colonial Jamaica. Throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, the British authorities there constantly undermined slave revolts, maroon uprisings, by recruiting informants. They'd promise freedom, maybe money, basically turning people against their own communities. Now, the specific documents from that very early time, they're a bit sparse. But the tactic itself, clearly well established. It was brutal, yeah. But for colonial powers, it was an effective way to keep control.
So using insiders becomes this sort of foundational tool for control against any group seen as a threat.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about controlling enslaved people. By the late 1800s, you see this moving firmly into political infiltration. Take Thomas Miller Beach. You might know him as Henri Le Caron,
Yeah.
British agent. Spent 20 years embedded deep inside the American Fenian Brotherhood. That's an Irish nationalist group.
20 years. Wow.
20 years. His penetration was so deep that in 1890, he actually gave public testimony in London.
Yeah.
Spilled everything, detailed his work as an informant. It was a huge shock. Really showed the public just how far these informant networks could reach into political movements. People were stunned.
And then around the same time, you've got socialism spreading, anarchism, and the early police forces, like the Pinkertons in the U.S., they started doing the same thing, right? Planting informers in unions, political groups.
Precisely. Labor unions, anarchist circles, they all got infiltrated. And these informers, they were taking huge personal risks. If they got caught, I mean, the retribution for that kind of treachery was often lethal. But the authorities, they saw them as invaluable. So the pattern was set. Group seems threatening. Find someone inside, get them to talk.
Okay, so that reliance is established early on. But then there's a shift, isn't there, towards professionalization?
Yes, that's the crucial turning point. Early 20th century, you start seeing the professionalization of informant use. Modern agencies are starting to form.
Right, and this is where the story, I think, gets really fascinating and, frankly, disturbing. The rise of agencies like the FBI, back then the Bureau of Investigation, they formalized using informants. It wasn't just ad hoc anymore, it became systematic.
Hmm.
And a really pivotal, super controversial example of this comes from civil rights history, the case of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Now, for those listening who know the history of Black liberation movements, Garvey is huge. In this case, it's a stark early example of how government power was turned against those efforts.
It truly is. J. Edgar Hoover, who basically was the FBI for decades, had a really aggressive stance against Garvey. He saw the UNIA with its huge following, its black nationalist ideas, its businesses like the Black Star Line. He saw it as a major threat. So Hoover made a very specific strategic move. He hired the Bureau's first black undercover agents,
Yeah.
specifically to infiltrate Garvey's organization. Think about that. It set this deeply controversial precedent. One of the first clear times a paid government informant was used against the civil rights movement, against political expression.
And one of those first Black agents was James Wormley Jones. He was a World War I vet, hired in 1919, given a code number, Agent 800. And Jones got deep inside, became a trusted figure in Garvey's movement. He even ended up managing Garvey's mail, his correspondence. That gave him access to everything, including potentially incriminating documents.
And it wasn't just Jones, right? There were others.
Yes, several other Black agents were assigned alongside Jones. Earl Titus, Arthur Noel Brent, Thomas Jefferson. The Bureau put resources into this.
So what was the result of all this infiltration? Well, the information they gathered, Jones and the others, it was instrumental. It directly led to Garvey's conviction in 1923 for mail fraud. It was related to selling shares in his Black Star Line shipping company, basically, overselling them. After the conviction, Garvey was imprisoned and then deported back to Jamaica. But the bigger picture here, this case set that clear, controversial precedent, targeting political activists, not just, bank robbers or gangsters. It raised huge questions about the government actively working to undermine social and political movements, especially black movements. The key takeaway, I think, is how early and how systematically these informant networks were deployed to disrupt charismatic black leaders and the mass movements they inspired.
Okay, so the FBI is formalizing this. Was this happening elsewhere too, like in the colonies? And did Jones just stop after Garvey?
Good questions. No, it wasn't just the U.S. And Jones, he actually kept working. He sort of became a double agent, moving from Garvey's circle to also penetrating the African Blood Brotherhood, the ABB. That was a black organization, more aligned with communism, led by Cyril Briggs. Even after Jones's cover was blown in 21, someone probably recognized him from his earlier police work. The intelligence he'd already gathered on multiple groups was valuable. It really showed how one informant could give intel on several targets. So distrust. And yes, this tactic was definitely used in colonial contexts. Take Jamaica again. British authorities there absolutely relied on informants. We have records from the 1930s showing intense surveillance of early Rastafari leaders. People like Leonard P. Howell, considered a founder of Rastafari. Howell was watched constantly, arrested repeatedly. The colonial police cultivated local contacts, basically, informants to keep tabs on his commune, report on anything they called preaching sedition. So, yeah, whether it was American cities or British colonies, recruiting insiders was a core strategy to undermine black liberation and Pan-African movements.
Okay, so this is becoming standard practice. And then as we get towards the mid-20th century, World War II, the Cold War, the whole espionage game shifts again, right?
It does. You get classic espionage cases becoming more prominent. Think Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo in World War II.
Sure.
Spanish guy, but worked for the British. He fed completely false information to the Nazis. A double agent. His work was crucial for Operation Fortitude, the big deception plan for D-Day. Made the Germans think the invasion was happening elsewhere. What's interesting about Garbo, though, is his motivation. He volunteered, driven by ideology. He hated the Nazis. And this points towards something intelligence agencies started formalizing around the late 1940s, this framework for understanding why people become informants. It's the acronym MECE.
M-E-E. What does that stand for?
Money, ideology, compromise, and ego. MICE. It's a way to categorize the main motivations. You see it play out in major Cold War cases. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, Soviet military intelligence, GRU, he started informing for the West in the early 60s. Why? Largely ideology. He was disillusioned with the Soviet system. And his intel, absolutely vital during the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably helped prevent nuclear war. But it went the other way, too. The KGB recruited deep assets in the West. Kim Philby, High up in British MI6, part of that infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring, he fed secrets to Moscow for decades. His motivation, ideology again, he was a committed communist. So by mid-century, you see, informants weren't just criminals being flipped. They were high-level officials, spies turning against their own side, driven by this complex mix of IC factors. The key insight really becomes understanding why someone betrays is almost as important as the secrets they reveal.
Okay, let's unpack that Cold War period more because, I mean, the stakes for informants then must have been incredibly high. A global showdown, right?
Oh, absolutely astronomical. This was a global chess game, like you said.
Yeah.
And an informant, a betrayal from within, it could literally shift the balance of power, and often did.
So both sides were actively trying to recruit, to turn people?
Constantly. And both had major successes. The CIA, the FBI, they managed to turn Soviet diplomats, KGB officers, GRU officers. We mentioned Penkovsky. Another huge one was Colonel Dmitry Polyakov, high-ranking GRU. He secretly informed for the CIA for over 20 years. Code names Top Hat, Bourbon. Why? Reportedly, deep disillusionment with the Soviet government. Maybe after they denied his son medical treatment, he betrayed countless Soviet spies and operations. Invaluable intelligence. But like I said, the pendulum swung both ways. The Soviets had massive successes too, penetrating Western agencies. Aldrich Ames, inside the CIA's own counterintelligence division. Robert Hansen, a senior FBI agent. These guys became informants for the KGB, then the Russian SVR motivation. Mostly money and ego. They sold out U.S. secrets, led to the deaths of agents working for the U.S. inside Russia. The damage was absolutely immense. It shows just how dangerous informants are when they betray their own side. So yeah, during the Cold War, informants weren't just about intel gathering. They were weapons, capable of incredible destruction, or in some cases like Penkovsky, potentially saving the world. It all depended on which side they chose.
But it wasn't just international spy games, was it? Some of the most controversial uses of informants, the ones that raise the deepest ethical questions, happened right here domestically.
Yeah.
You mentioned J. Edgar Hoover earlier, COINTELPRO.
Right. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, ran from the 1950s, really ramped up in the 60s into the early 70s, and its goal was disruption. It used infiltration, informants, psychological warfare, even illegal methods to target a huge range of groups Hoover saw as subversive. The Communist Party USA, yes, but also civil rights groups, the Black Power movement, anti-Vietnam War protesters, feminist organizations, Native American activists. The list is long. And informants were absolutely central to COINTELPRO.
And this led to some truly tragic events. The case of Fred Hampton in Chicago.
Yes, one of the most infamous and devastating outcomes. Fred Hampton was a charismatic young leader in the Illinois Black Panther Party. The FBI saw him as a major threat, potentially unifying different groups. So in 1968, they recruited a guy named William O'Neill. He was just 19, a petty criminal caught stealing a car. The FBI offered him a deal. Charges dropped, plus a monthly payment if he infiltrated the Panthers. O'Neill agreed. And he didn't just infiltrate, he rose through the ranks. Became Hampton's chief of security, his bodyguard, all while secretly feeding detailed reports back to his FBI handler. For anyone who studied that era, Hampton's story is just chilling. A stark reminder of how far the state would go.
It's almost unbelievable. He became head of security. And then what happened?
Then came the climax, late 1969, based on O'Neill's intel, including a detailed floor plan of Hampton's apartment he provided to the FBI.
He gave them a floor plan.
A detailed floor plan, yeah. And then, even more shockingly, there were strong allegations, including from O'Neill himself later, that on the night of December 3rd, 1969, he drugged Fred Hampton's drink to make sure Hampton wouldn't wake up easily during the raid. Early the next morning, December 4th, Chicago police, working with the state's attorney's office, but heavily guided by FBI intelligence from O'Neill, raided the apartment. Guns blazing. Fred Hampton was shot and killed in his bed. Fellow Panther Mark Clark was also killed. Several others were wounded. The initial story was a shootout, but evidence later showed the police fired almost all the shots. The FBI's direct role, using O'Neill, was eventually exposed. O'Neill went into witness protection. His identity became public years later. In 1990, on the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, he ran onto an expressway and was killed by a car. Officially ruled a suicide. He had admitted his role in interviews before his death.
God, that's horrific.
It is. And the Hampton case really shows how informants could be used not just to gather intel, but to actively neutralize leaders. Hoover had explicitly directed agents to prevent the rise of a black messiah. O'Neill helped make that happen for Hampton. It also exposes that deep moral ambiguity. Sure, an informant inside a militant group might prevent violence, but here, O'Neill facilitated what many call a state-sanctioned assassination. The key insight is how a system meant for intelligence can be twisted into a tool for political elimination.
And the infiltration wasn't limited to the Panthers, right? Malcolm X's inner circle was penetrated too.
Deeply. This involved the NYPD, specifically their secret intelligence unit known as Boss I, the Bureau of Special Services and Investigation. They had an undercover black officer named Eugene Roberts. He adopted the persona of Brother Gene, presented himself as a devout follower of Malcolm X after Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, and formed his own groups, like the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU. Roberts got so close he became part of Malcolm X's security detail, one of his bodyguards.
A bodyguard who was actually a police informant.
Exactly. And the most chilling part, Roberts was right there, on stage or very near it, at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem on February 21st, 1965, when Malcolm X was assassinated. There are famous photographs from the chaotic aftermath showing Roberts attempting to give Malcolm CPR, trying to administer first aid. For years, he was seen as just a loyal follower caught in the tragedy.
That image, knowing he was an informant, it just sends shivers down your spine, especially for people who revere Malcolm X.
It absolutely does. The truth only came out years later. Roberts had been filing regular reports on Malcolm's activities, his contacts, his plans, back to the NYPD. And that intelligence was undoubtedly shared with the FBI, who also had Malcolm under intense surveillance. Now, the full story of who was really behind Malcolm X's assassination is still debated. His family continues to push for investigations, alleging a wider conspiracy involving law enforcement cover-ups. But Roberts' mere presence, that deep inside the inner circle, it speaks volumes. And there's more. Decades later, another former undercover NYPD officer, Raymond Wood, came forward. He confessed he'd infiltrated Malcolm's associates before the assassination, under orders to entrap them in a plot, potentially to discredit Malcolm. Wood also claimed his NYPD handlers and the FBI knew about the assassination plot in advance and did nothing to stop it, maybe even facilitated it. While Wood's full claims are still being assessed, it just underscores how pervasive the infiltration was. The key takeaway again is that long shadow of distrust these operations cast, especially when they intersect with these moments of profound loss and trauma for Black communities and movements.
It's really heavy stuff. But informants weren't only used against Black activists or political dissidents, right? The FBI also used them against groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin, and it's equally complex and controversial. During the peak of the civil rights movement, the FBI did place infiltrators inside the KKK, particularly in the Deep South. One of the most notorious was Gary Thomas Rowe, Jr. He was a white guy from Alabama. The FBI recruited him in 1960 to join the Klan and report back on their activities, their members, their violent plans. He became a key racial informant, as the FBI termed it.
So he was providing warnings, helping stop Klan violence.
Sometimes. He did provide names. He did give advance warnings of some violent plots. For instance, he reportedly tipped off the FBI about a planned armed attack by Klansmen on Black college students in 1963, which was then prevented. However, Rowe's involvement went way beyond just observing and reporting. He actively participated in Klan violence himself. He admitted being present during the brutal beatings of Freedom Riders in Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama in 1961. And here's the kicker. He had warned his FBI handler about the planned attacks on the Freedom Riders, but the Bureau, under orders from Hoover apparently, did little or nothing to intervene and protect them.
They knew it was coming and didn't stop it. While their informant was there?
That's what the record suggests. It gets worse. Rowe was also alleged to have had knowledge of, or maybe even some involvement in, the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 young Black girls, though his exact role there remains murky and disputed. But the most infamous incident involving Rowe was the murder of Viola Liuzzo in March 1965. She was a white civil rights activist from Detroit who came down to Alabama for the Selma to Montgomery March. Rowe was in a car with 3 other Klansmen. They chased Liuzzo's car on a highway after the march, pulled alongside, and shot her dead. Rowe was in the car when it happened. He immediately called his FBI handler and reported it, which led to the quick arrest of the other 3 Klansmen. Rowe himself was initially presented as a key witness, not an accomplice.
But he was in the car when she was murdered. That's an accessory to murder, essentially. For the FBI, this must have been a nightmare.
A massive public relations nightmare and a profound ethical one. They had an informant who not only failed to prevent a murder, but was right there, participating in the events leading up to it. Rowe's FBI handler later testified that Rowe had repeatedly, quote, ignored FBI instructions to avoid violent situations. He often acted as an agent provocateur, someone who doesn't just observe crime, but actively encourages or participates in it. The Liuzzo case just starkly laid bare that ethical tightrope. Yes, Rowe's intel sometimes helped stop other Klan plots, but the FBI kept him active, kept paying him, even though they knew he was involved in violence. They prioritized the intelligence goal over preventing immediate harm, arguably making the Bureau complicit. The legal fallout was messy. No FBI officials were ever charged in Leo's death. Rowe eventually went into witness protection, but the scandal did contribute to internal FBI reforms and new guidelines stating informants should not be directly involved in violent crimes, though as we'll see, those guidelines continue to be tested. The key insight here, the pursuit of intelligence, even against genuinely violent groups like the Klan, can lead authorities into these incredibly deep ethical compromises, blurring the line between preventing crime and enabling it.
Looking back at all this history, COINTELPRO, Roe, the political infiltration, what does it tell us about trust? Trust within movements, trust between communities and law enforcement. It seems shattered. And how did this whole informant system evolve when it turned its focus more squarely onto, say, organized crime?
Well, the impact on trust was and remains profound, especially for communities who felt targeted. But shifting focus to organized crime, yeah, that's another major chapter. Many of the biggest breakthroughs against the mafia, against drug cartels, even street gangs, they've come from flipping members, convincing someone inside to cooperate, to testify. A huge landmark moment in the U.S. was Joseph Valachi's testimony back in 1963. Valachi was a mid-level soldier in the Genovese crime family. He was in prison, feared he was marked for death by his own boss, so he decided to cooperate with federal authorities. He became the first mafia insider to publicly confirm the existence of La Cosa Nostra, its structure, its rituals, its secret commissions. His testimony, broadcast live on TV during Senate hearings, absolutely shattered the mafia's code of silence y omertà. It gave law enforcement a roadmap and significantly boosted prosecutions. It showed the immense power of getting an insider to talk.
And that became a major tactic, right? Flippin' wise guys. Like with John Gotti.
That's exactly. Fast forward to the early 90s. John Gotti, head of the Gambino family, the Teflon Don, because charges never stuck. How do they finally nail him? By flipping his underboss, Salvatore's Sammy the Bull, Gravano. In 1991, Gravano agreed to testify against Gotti. His testimony in 1992 was devastating, securing Gotti's conviction and life sentence. Now, the deal Gravano got was hugely controversial. He confessed to participating in 19 murders. 19. But in exchange for his testimony against Gotti, he received a sentence of only about 5 years. Many people were outraged, but the SBI and prosecutors, they saw it as a necessary evil, a worthwhile bargain to finally take down the most powerful mafia boss in the country.
A deal with the devil, essentially, but sometimes those deals go spectacularly wrong, don't they? I'm thinking of Whitey Bulger in Boston.
Yes. The Whitey Bulger case. That is probably the textbook example of an informant relationship going completely off the rails, becoming utterly corrupted. It's a crucial story. James Whitey Bulger was the brutal leader of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American crime group in Boston. And secretly, starting around the mid-1970s, he became a top-echelon FBI informant. He was initially recruited by an ambitious FBI agent named John Connolly, who actually grew up in the same South Boston neighborhood as Bulger. The pitch was, help us take down the Italian mafia, your rivals, the Angiulo crime family who dominated Boston's underworld. Bulger agreed. But according to accounts, he made it clear from the start. He supposedly told Connolly, I will not be called an informant, I will be your strategist. That really speaks volumes about his ego, his desire to control the relationship from the get-go.
And he really did manipulate the situation, didn't he? He wasn't just giving information, he was using the FBI.
He absolutely was. In practice, Bulger and his top lieutenant, Stephen Flemmi, who was also an informant, fed the FBI information that helped them decimate the Angiulo family, their main competition. This effectively cleared the field. It allowed Bulger's Winter Hill Gang to consolidate power and basically monopolize organized crime and Boston drug trafficking, extortion, loan sharking, murder. And for over a decade, Bulger operated with virtual impunity. Why? Because Agent Connolly and some other corrupt agents within the FBI's Boston office were protecting him. They tipped him off to investigations, fed him information on rivals, covered up his crimes, all in exchange for the relatively low-level intelligence Bulger provided on the Italians and others.
So the FBI was essentially fielding a mob boss while he committed crimes.
That's exactly what happened. It was, as you said, a deal with the devil, and it completely unraveled in the 1990s when state police and honest federal agents finally started closing in. It emerged that Bulger had been directly involved in or responsible for at least 8 murders while he was supposedly working as an FBI informant. And Connolly and others had actively helped cover up these crimes, sometimes even leaking information that led to people being killed by Bulger. Connolly was eventually convicted of racketeering and obstruction of justice, and later, second-degree murder in connection with one of Bulger's hits. The Bulger scandal was catastrophic for the FBI's reputation. It exposed how an informant program could become so deeply corrupted that the handlers ended up serving the informant, not the other way around. Someone famously quipped that corrupt FBI agents were the ones informing him. Bulger totally turned the tables. It led to major internal FBI reforms regarding informant handling, much stricter guidelines, more oversight, and mandatory reviews. But it remains this incredibly dark stain, a stark warning about what happens when oversight fails and the lines get blurred. Bulger's story is the ultimate cautionary tale. The informant can end up wielding the system itself.
Okay, so we've seen informants in political movements, organized crime. What about more recently? Terrorism, global conflicts. How has the role evolved there, especially after 9/11?
Well, the post-9/11 era saw a massive surge in the use of informants, particularly by the FBI domestically and agencies like MI5 in the UK, specifically for counterterrorism. The perceived threat was so high, the pressure to prevent attacks was immense, and informants were seen as absolutely essential to get inside extremist networks.
And were they successful? Did informants actually stop plots?
There have been documented successes, yes. In the UK, MI5 credits informants, or undercover operatives, with playing key roles in thwarting several major plots. For example, the 2006 plot to simultaneously bomb multiple transatlantic airliners using liquid explosives. An informant inside the group was crucial to uncovering that. It could have been absolutely devastating, worse than 9/11 in some ways. More recently, in 2018, they foiled a plot to assassinate the then Prime Minister, Theresa May. An undercover MI5 operative posed as a terrorist facilitator, supplied the wannabe attacker with a fake bomb vest and inert explosives, and then arrested him. MI5 and other agencies point to these kinds of sting operations as proof of effectiveness. They argue they provide fake tools, monitor the suspect's intent, and make the arrest before anyone gets hurt.
But that leads to the whole entrapment issue, right? Especially in the US, there have been big controversies around whether the informants basically created the plots themselves.
Exactly. That's the flip side, and it's a huge point of contention, particularly in the U.S. Several high-profile terrorism prosecutions have faced strong defenses based on entrapment claims. The 2020 plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer is a prime example. It involved a right-wing militia group, but it turned out there were at least a dozen FBI informants or undercover agents deeply involved in the group, some in leadership roles. Defense lawyers argue that these informants weren't just monitoring, they were actively driving the plot forward, suggesting ideas, providing resources, encouraging the defendants. And it had some success. While the main ringleaders were eventually convicted in federal court, some other defendants were acquitted, with juries seemingly persuaded that the government had overstepped, had induced the crime. You also had the Newburgh 4 case back in 2009. 4 men convicted of plotting to bomb synagogues in the Bronx. But the central figure pushing them along, offering them money, weapons, which were inert fakes supplied by the FBI, and encouragement was a controversial FBI informant. Critics argued these were down on their luck. Individuals led into a plot they never would have conceived or executed on their own.
So, where's the line? Law enforcement says it's vital. Critics say they're manufacturing crime.
It's a really fine line and a difficult balance. Law enforcement argues these sting operations, guided by informants, are indispensable. They point to cases where real plots were seemingly stopped, like catching accomplices of the Times Square bomber in 2010 through an informant. They say you have to intervene early. Critics, however, argue that in many cases, especially involving marginalized or mentally vulnerable individuals, the informants essentially become the plotters. They create crimes to get convictions and justify budgets. They argue resources would be better spent tracking genuinely dangerous individuals who have the means and intent already, rather than coaching people into conspiracies. It's a fundamental disagreement about tactics and ethics. The core tension remains. How do you use human intelligence effectively without crossing that line into creating the very crimes you're supposed to be preventing?
And this informant reliance plays out internationally too, sometimes causing friction, like with Israel and Palestinian informants.
Yes, absolutely. Israel's internal security service, the Shin Bet, has long relied heavily on Palestinian informants in the West Bank and Gaza. It's been a key part of their strategy to prevent terrorist attacks, particularly suicide bombings during periods like the Second Intifada. But the recruitment methods are often highly controversial. They frequently involve pressure, exploiting someone's need for medical permits to travel to Israel for treatment, leveraging legal troubles, offering money to desperate individuals, sometimes even blackmail. While Shin Bet argues this is necessary and has saved countless lives within Palestinian society, these informants are utterly reviled as collaborators. If their identities are discovered, they face severe consequences, often execution by militant groups. The whole situation operates in this intense ethical gray zone, particularly given the context of military occupation.
And we see similar dynamics in other conflicts, even causing diplomatic issues, like in Burkina Faso recently.
Right. The situation in Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government is a good recent example. His government is strongly anti-French influence, pushing out French troops, seeking new alliances. This has created huge tension with France and its allies. And naturally, in that kind of atmosphere, there's intense paranoia about spies and informants. In December 2023, Burkina Faso detained 4 French nationals, accusing them of being spies. France eventually admitted they were intelligence agents, DGSE, though claimed they were just technical support staff at the embassy. They were eventually released, but it was a diplomatic spat. Then, just this past April, 2024, not 2025 as mentioned in the outline, the junta in Ouagadougou announced they'd arrested 9 individuals, military personnel, and civilians, accusing them of plotting a coup to assassinate President Traoré, allegedly acting as proxies for a foreign power, though they didn't name which one. Whether these plots are entirely real or partly amplified by paranoia, it shows how informant activity, or even just a suspicion of it, remains a constant feature of geopolitical maneuvering, especially in post-colonial contexts, where new leaders often rightly assume foreign powers or rivals have informants in their midst. It fuels instability, spy versus spy games, and sometimes internal crackdowns or witch hunts.
It's clear informants are everywhere, used in so many different contexts. So let's get into the how. How do agencies actually convince someone to betray their country, their organization, their friends? Let's really dig into that MIC framework. Money, ideology, compromise, ego. How do these actually work in practice?
Okay, yeah, MIE is the classic model handlers use to understand and exploit motivations. Let's break it down. First, money. M. This is the most straightforward. Financial reward. Simple greed or sometimes desperation. Agencies literally pay people for information. This can range from small payments to a street-level drug dealer giving up his supplier to huge sums offered to high-level foreign officials or defectors. During the Cold War, the CIA routinely paid its assets, sometimes setting them up with comfortable lives. The FBI paid Gary Rowe that monthly stipend, remember, for infiltrating the Klan. It's transactional.
But it can't be just about money, can it? Surely that has limits. What are the downsides of relying just on cash?
Absolutely. There are big pitfalls. Handlers often caution that informants motivated purely by money can be unreliable. They might exaggerate information or invent it entirely just to keep the payments coming. They could be mercenary, willing to sell secrets to the highest bidder, maybe even working for both sides. You mentioned the CIA trying to bribe Egypt's President Nasser with $3 million in the 50s. He reportedly took the money and basically laughed it off, gave them nothing useful in return. It shows that wealthy or powerful targets often aren't swayed by cash alone. Their motivations are usually more complex. So while money is often part of the package, especially for criminal informants or those in dire straits, experienced handlers know it's often not enough on its own to ensure loyalty or reliable intelligence.
Okay, so what about the next one? Ideology. This feels different, more about belief, conviction.
Exactly. This is about appealing to someone's core beliefs, their political convictions, their sense of right and wrong, or their disillusionment with their own side's ideology. And informants motivated by ideology. They can be the most valuable and the most dedicated. They're often not doing it for personal gain, but because they genuinely believe it's the right thing to do. They might even volunteer. We talked about Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB colonel who spied for Britain's MI6 out of sheer disgust with the Soviet system. That's pure ideology. The Cambridge Five spying for the USSR because they believed in communism. Ideology. Conversely, many Soviet bloc military and intelligence officers volunteered to help the West because they'd lost faith in communism, domestically too. Some of the FBI informants inside groups like the Black Panthers or anti-war movements weren't coerced. They were ideologically opposed to those groups, maybe held strong right-wing or patriotic views, and saw the activists as dangerous radicals threatening the country. They wanted to help stop them. Ideology is powerful because it provides an internal justification. These informants often see themselves as patriots or freedom fighters, not traitors, which could make them very committed.
Right. Then we get to compromise. C, or coercion. This sounds like the darker side of recruitment. Blackmail threats?
It often is. This is where leverage comes in. Exploiting a target's vulnerabilities. The most common form, especially in domestic law enforcement, is catching someone in a crime and offering them a stark choice. Cooperate with us, become an informant, or face prosecution, and potentially a long prison sentence. Work for us or go to jail. The FBI and DEA use this constantly with drug offenses. Flip the small fish to get the big ones. But compromise can also involve non-criminal leverage, threatening to expose embarrassing secrets, maybe an extramarital affair, hidden debts, past illegal acts. The KGB was notorious for its honey traps, remember, luring targets, often Western diplomats or businessmen, into sexually compromising situations, filming them, and then blackmailing them into becoming spies. Now, agencies are often wary of relying solely on coercion. Why? Because it tends to produce resentful, unreliable informants. Someone forced into it might look for ways to undermine their handlers, feed bad information, or just do the bare minimum. They're wobbly, as some handlers put it. The CIA, for instance, generally prefers volunteers or ideologically motivated assets over purely coerced ones for long-term espionage. But for short-term games or in domestic policing, coercion is definitely a common tool. William O'Neill, forced into informing on the Panthers to beat his own rap. Prime example. It worked for the FBI's immediate goal, but look how unstable and ultimately tragic that situation became.
Okay, makes sense. And the last one, ego, E, or sometimes excitement is included here. What's this about?
This taps into very human needs. The desire to feel important, special, powerful, maybe get revenge, or just experience some thrills. Some people become informants because it boosts their ego. It makes them feel like they have secret knowledge, that they're playing a significant role, maybe getting attention from powerful handlers they wouldn't otherwise receive. Think about those first black FBI agents in the Garvey case. Part of their motivation might well have been the prestige, the unique status of being chosen for that special assignment at a time when opportunities for black men in federal law enforcement were extremely limited. Revenge is a big ego driver, too. Someone passed over for promotion in the military might betray secrets to get back at the system. An extremist who feels slighted by their group's leaders might turn informant out of spite. Aldrich Ames, the CIA turncoat. Money was a factor, yes, but colleagues consistently described his immense pride, his arrogance, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else. Part of his motivation was likely the ego trip of successfully duping the entire agency for years.
And that thrill-seeking aspect, the excitement of a double life.
That's definitely part of it for some personalities. While the reality of being an informant is often mundane, stressful, and dangerous, the idea can be appealing. Living on the edge, clandestine meetings, secret codes, feeling like you're in a spy movie. Handlers are trained to play on this. They stroke the informant's ego, praise their courage and importance, give them cool-sounding code names, make them feel like they're part of an elite, secret club, saving the country or taking down bad guys. For someone feeling insignificant in their regular life, this can be a powerful psychological hook. As one CIA veteran put it, appealing to ego, giving someone a chance to feel important and maybe hit back at a system they felt wronged them, can be incredibly effective.
So in reality, it's rarely just one of these MIC factors alone, is it? Recruiters probably mix and match.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost always a combination. A good recruiter assesses the target's vulnerabilities and motivations, and then crafts a pitch that hits multiple buttons. Take Whitey Bulger again. The FBI appealed to his ego, BR strategist, outsmart the Italians. His self-interest money, protecting his criminal empire, was his real payment, and his handler used personal rapport, playing on their shared background. Ego compromise in a subtle way. Or recruiting a gang member. The pitch might involve money, payments, compromise, leniency on charges, maybe ideology, help us stop the violence killing people in your neighborhood, and ego, you'll be our key guy, you'll make a real difference. It's about finding the right cocktail of incentives and pressures.
Okay, so they get them recruited, but managing them, handling them long-term, that sounds incredibly complicated and risky.
It is. It's a constant balancing act. Agencies have strict protocols, or at least they're supposed to. Informants get code names. We heard Tension for O'Neill, Steak Knife for Sabotage in the IRA, Agent 800 for James Wormley Jones. This protects their identity and adds to that mystique. Handlers meet them secretly, maybe in safe houses, cars, parks. They exchange information, give instructions, sometimes provide money or equipment. Trust is huge, but tricky. Handlers rarely tell informants the full picture, just what they need to know for their specific task, need-to-know basis. This limits damage if the informant is compromised or turns out to be unreliable. Conversely, handlers have to constantly assess if the informant is being truthful. Is the intel accurate? Are they exaggerating? Are they holding back? Good handlers always try to corroborate information from other sources. For high-level, long-term informants, especially in counterintelligence, agencies use tools like polygraphs, psychological assessments, background checks to try and weed out liars or potential double agents. But despite all that, history is littered with informants who successfully played both sides, double agents, triple agents. The CIA got badly burned in the 1980s by Soviet intelligence feeding them dangle agents, people pretending to defect or inform, who are actually loyal to Moscow and feeding disinformation. sometimes leading to the capture and execution of genuine CIA assets inside the USSR. Moles like Ames and Hansen facilitated that. So running informants always carries immense risk. You might be nurturing a viper. Good case officers are constantly vigilant, looking for red flags, signs of deception, changes in behavior, and they have to be prepared to cut an informant loose immediately if they suspect compromise or disloyalty. It's a high-stakes psychological game. And some argue that relying too much on the simple ACEs model can actually blind you. You need to understand the deeper, more complex psychology of the individual you're dealing with.
Right, that makes sense. Now, building on that, let's bring this closer to home for many of our listeners. How have these hidden hands, these informants, specifically impacted histories in Jamaica and the wider Pan-African world? This is where it gets really interesting for movements our audience follows closely.
Jamaica in the 1970s is a really potent example. The island was politically polarized, incredibly volatile. You had Prime Minister Michael Manley and his People's National Party, PNP, pursuing democratic socialism, building ties with Cuba, which worried the U.S. immensely during the Cold War. On the other side was Edward Seaga and the Jamaica Labor Party, JLP, strongly conservative, pro-Western, pro-U.S. Now, there are credible reports, including from former CIA officers and investigative journalists, suggesting the CIA actively worked to destabilize Manley's government. This reportedly involved funneling money and weapons to Sega's JLP and associated violent gangs, and crucially, cultivating informants across the island within unions, political parties, maybe even Manley's own security forces. Manley himself, later in life, spoke openly about his belief that the CIA had infiltrated his government and party, using informants to sow discord, leak damaging information, maybe even organize disruptive strikes or violence to undermine his administration, leading up to the very violent 1980 election, which Sega won.
And this gets even murkier, right, with connections between intelligence agencies, political factions, and the drug trade, like the Shower Posse gang.
Exactly. It becomes incredibly tangled. During that same period, the 1970s and 80s, the international cocaine trade exploded and Jamaica became a major transit point. The DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, was also active on the island. And they too recruited informants, including within Kingston's powerful and notoriously violent street gangs, or posses, which often had strong political affiliations. The Shower Posse, based in Tivoli Gardens, was heavily aligned with Sega's JLP. Now here's where the controversial claims come in, particularly from writers focusing on Pan-African history and geopolitics like Ogoyufo Anu. They allege that the leader of the Shower Posse, Lester Lloyd Coke, better known as Jim Brown, wasn't just a drug kingpin being targeted by the DEA. They claim he was also effectively on the CIA's payroll, or at least protected by CIA assets, because his gang acted as violent enforcers against Manley supporters and leftists serving the anti-communist agenda. Some even claim Seaga himself was essentially a CIA asset.
Wow, so a gang leader potentially working with both the DEA and the CIA playing different roles.
If those claims hold water, yes. It paints this picture of a deeply muddy entanglement, as some call it, involving espionage, organized crime, and political warfare, all intersecting on the streets of Kingston. The theory is Jim Brown could coordinate his drug running and political violence, possibly with tacit approval or protection from certain intelligence contacts, as long as he served their broader geopolitical goals. The long-term consequences for Jamaica? Devastating. Years of intense gang warfare, fueled partly by these political criminal alliances, deep institutional mistrust. And the story didn't end there. Jim Brown himself died under very suspicious circumstances, a mysterious fire in his jail cell in 1992, just before he was due to be extradited to the U.S., where he might have testified about his connections. His son, Christopher Judas Coke, inherited his father's mantle in Tivoli Gardens and became even more powerful, leading to that massive security operation and standoff when the government finally moved to extradite him in 2010, again amid allegations of deep political protection over the years. It's a long, complex, and often tragic saga rooted, at least in part, in that era of Cold War informant politics.
And this use of informants wasn't just in electoral politics or gangs, right? It extended to cultural and religious movements too, like Rastafari.
Yes, definitely. Both the British colonial authorities earlier on and later the independent Jamaican state used informants to monitor and sometimes suppress the Rastafari movement. We mentioned Leonard Howell's commune, Pinnacle, being infiltrated back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Local police informants reporting back on what they saw as subversive anti-establishment rhetoric. This surveillance continued after the Coral Gardens incident in 1963. A violent clash followed by a brutal state crackdown on Rastafarians, the Jamaican police's special branch, almost certainly intensified efforts to place moles within Rasta communities to get advance warning of any perceived militancy or unrest. Later in the 1970s, when Rastafari culture, especially through reggae music, gained global influence and often aligned with Michael Manley's populist message, figures like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh became subjects of interest. Tosh famously sang about infiltration. Can't blame the youth if them suck their teeth on the CIA. And while it's never been definitively proven, persistent conspiracy theories link the 1976 assassination attempt on Bob Marley just before a major peace concert aimed at easing political violence to the CIA or its local assets, given Marley's immense cultural influence and perceived support for Manley.
And that legacy of suspicion, it lingers even today, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Within many Rastafari circles, there's still this deep-seated belief that the Babylon system, their term for oppressive state structures, actively plants spies and informants among them. It reflects a profound, historically rooted mistrust born directly from these past experiences of surveillance and informer operations.
So moving beyond Jamaica, this pattern of surveilling Pan-Africanist movements and leaders through informants, that was widespread.
Oh yes, globally. After Garvey, numerous other Pan-Africanist leaders and organizations faced intense scrutiny from Western intelligence agencies, and informants were a key tool. Think Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, both faced destabilization efforts widely believed to involve CIA-backed informants and plots. Black Panther Party members who went into exile seeking refuge in places like Algeria were still monitored, often with the cooperation of host governments or through informants recruited locally or sent from the U.S. In the UK, MI5 kept extensive files on West Indian immigrant activists and Black Power groups in London in the 60s and 70s. They actively recruited Black Britons to serve as informants inside organizations like the BlackUnity and Freedom Party. And perhaps the most brutal manifestation was in apartheid South Africa. The regime created a unit called Vlakplaas, which recruited captured members of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, and turned them into askaris. These turned guerrillas then used their inside knowledge to help the security forces hunt down, torture, and assassinate their former comrades. Joe Momocello was one of the most notorious askaris, confessing after apartheid ended to participating in numerous killings while acting as a police informant deep inside the anti-apartheid underground. These stories explain the visceral hatred and contempt that freedom fighters often held for informants, seeing them as the ultimate betrayers.
Such a heavy price for betrayal. Was there ever a counter-narrative? People pretending to inform but actually helping their side?
Yes, that definitely happened too, though it's often harder to document. There are accounts from various liberation struggles of individuals who pretended to cooperate with colonial authorities or security forces, feeding them disinformation or low-level intelligence, while secretly remaining loyal to the liberation movement and passing crucial warnings back. It highlights the incredibly complex, multi-layered game of deception involved on all sides.
Okay, let's fast forward again to the present day. We mentioned Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso earlier. That situation seems almost like a modern echo of these past struggles, a revolutionary government wary of outside interference and internal betrayal.
It does feel like history rhyming, in a way. Traoré's government came to power via coup, ousted the French military presence, and is actively forging ties with Russia and other non-Western powers. It's a direct challenge to the old neocolonial order in the Sahel region. So it's definitely logical that they would be extremely concerned about French intelligence, the DGSE, and potentially other regional powers trying to infiltrate their ranks or sponsor opposition through informants. The detention of those French agents in late 2023 and the announcement of the foiled coup plot in April 2024 involving alleged internal collaborators working for outsiders, these events fit that pattern perfectly. It underscores that in many parts of the post-colonial world, the assumption that foreign intelligence agencies or domestic rivals have informants embedded within the government or military is often not paranoia, but a realistic assessment of the political landscape. It leads to constant counterintelligence efforts, suspicion, sometimes purges, and that ongoing spy versus spy dynamic.
Okay, so if we try to tie all of this together, looking at this huge span of history, from slave revolts to modern geopolitics, it seems undeniable, right? Informers have played this massive, often hidden role in shaping events. They feel like a necessary evil sometimes.
Necessary evil is a term often used, yeah. And double-edged sword is another one that comes up constantly because it captures the paradox. Their effectiveness, in certain contexts, is undeniable. Many major law enforcement and intelligence successes simply wouldn't have happened without an inside source. We talked about dismantling mafia families, taking down drug kingpins. Counterterrorism officials will tell you informants are absolutely vital for stopping plots before they happen. Crippling enemy spy rings often relies on defectors or moles. Think about World War II again, that British double-cross system. They didn't just get lucky. They systematically identified nearly every German agent sent to Britain, arrested them, and then turned most of them into double agents working for MI5. These turned agents then fed a carefully orchestrated stream of misinformation back to Germany, including the crucial deception about where the D-Day landings would occur. It was a strategic masterpiece, largely built on controlling informants.
And then there's the case in Northern Ireland with the IRA. Steak knife, that sounds like another example of deep, impactful infiltration.
Freddie Scappaticci, codenamed Steak Knife by British Army intelligence. Yes, a huge case. He was an informant, a mole, operating right at the very heart of the provisional IRA for roughly 25 years, from the late 70s into the early 2000s. And his position? Incredibly sensitive. He was a leading figure in the IRA's internal security unit, the unit responsible for hunting down and interrogating suspected informers, the nutting squad, as it was grimly known. So the guy hunting spies was the biggest spy.
That's deeply ironic and incredibly valuable for the British, presumably.
Immensely valuable. He reportedly provided intelligence that led to the capture or killing of many IRA members, thwarted bombings and other operations, and compromised countless IRA activities. British intelligence officials internally called him the jewel in the crown. They believed his information saved hundreds of lives and significantly hampered the IRA's campaign. But, and this is a massive figgity, the ethical cost was horrific. To maintain his credibility within the IRA, to protect his position as the master spy hunter, Scappaticci himself participated in the abduction, torture, and murder of suspected informers. People he knew or suspected were also British agents, or just people the IRA wrongly accused. He had blood on his hands, potentially dozens of murders linked to him, all while supposedly working for the state.
So the British state knew their top agent inside the IRA was also a murderer.
That's the deeply disturbing question at the heart of the steak knife scandal. Did they know? Did they look the other way? Did they implicitly or even explicitly authorize his involvement in these killings to protect their prize asset? A long-running independent investigation called Operation Canova, led by former Chief Constable John Butcher, concluded that Steak Knife was likely responsible for more deaths than he saved, and that the security force's handling of him involved systemic failings and lost opportunities to prevent murders. However, prosecutors decided against charging Scappaticci, who died in 2023 before the final report, or several MI5 and military intelligence figures connected to his case, citing insufficient evidence for a realistic prospect of conviction. It left many victims' families feeling that the state protected its agent, even one who committed heinous crimes, above delivering justice. It's maybe the starkest example of that extreme end of the ethical tightrope. How much crime, even murder, is permissible for an informant to commit in the name of a greater intelligence goal, and who is held accountable?
Beyond these huge espionage cases, what about more routine counterterrorism or drug work? Are informants still seen as essential there?
Officials absolutely argue they are. Post-9/11 counterterrorism successes, while often classified, are frequently attributed to timely information from human sources. We mentioned the FBI's informant Emad Salem, who helped foil a follow-up plot after the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. MI5 points to the 2004 UK fertilizer bomb plot involving al-Qaeda-linked extremists being disrupted thanks to an informant inside the cell. They argue these cases show genuine threats being stopped. And in the day-to-day fight against drug trafficking, flipping lower-level dealers or couriers to provide information leading up the chain to major suppliers remains a fundamental tactic for agencies like the DEA. It's how they build complex conspiracy cases.
Okay, so the effectiveness is clear in many cases. But the controversies just don't go away, do they? That double-edged sword keeps cutting.
It really does. The entrapment debate we discussed earlier, it's persistent. Critics continue to raise alarms about informants, often incentivized by money or reduced sentences, actively pushing targets towards crimes they might not have otherwise committed, just to secure arrests and convictions. Creating crimes to boast of victories, as one critic put it. Then there are the abuses in regular policing. Sometimes untrained or poorly managed informants take reckless risks. Sometimes they lie to settle scores or frame rivals, leading to wrongful arrests or convictions. There's been tragic cases where young, vulnerable people used as confidential informants were sent into dangerous drug buys and got killed. That case in Florida led to Rachel's Law, aimed at better protecting informants. An over-reliance on informant testimony, especially when it's uncorroborated and comes from someone getting a deal, is a known factor in wrongful convictions.
And those deep moral and legal gray zones we saw with Roe, Bolger, Steak Knife, they just keep reappearing, don't they? What happens when the state's own agent commits serious crimes?
That remains one of the most challenging aspects. How much criminal conduct should be tolerated? Where's the line drawn and who draws it? These scandals had led to reforms. We mentioned the FBI tightening its informant guidelines after Bulger and earlier scandals like COINTELPRO exposed in the 70s by the Church Committee. More paperwork, more supervisor approval, annual reviews trying to ensure informants are controlled, not controlling. In the UK, that recent legal challenge over MI5 secretly authorizing informant crime led to the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Act 2021. This law basically put on a formal legal footing the power of agencies like MI5, police, even the Environment Agency, to authorize their informants or undercover officers to commit crimes as part of their work, provided it's deemed necessary and proportionate and gets internal sign-off.
But that sounds like it just legalized the problem, didn't it? Giving official permission for informants to break the law.
That's precisely the argument from human rights groups. They were appalled. They argued it creates a licensed impunity, potentially allowing informants to commit serious offenses, maybe even violence, with a state-sanctioned get-out-of-jail-free card and very little external oversight or accountability. The government's counter-argument was that this reflects reality. To infiltrate dangerous terrorist groups or organized crime gangs, informants have to participate in some level of criminal activity to be credible. They argued the act provides a clear legal framework and safeguards, whereas before it was murkier. They point back to cases like Steak Knife or the need to stop terror plots, saying this kind of latitude, properly managed, is unfortunately essential in extreme circumstances. It's a fierce, ongoing debate about necessity versus impunity.
Which brings us right back to that core paradox, doesn't it? The duality of the informant, seen as heroes by some, traitors by others.
Exactly. It's all about perspective. James Wormley Jones, pioneering black FBI agent in the Bureau's history books, or a Judas figure to followers of MarcusGarvey, Whitey Bulger, neighborhood Robin Hood to some in South Boston who felt he kept drugs out, which wasn't true, or a vicious killer and rat to the families of his victims and the mafia he informed on. Their identity is completely fractured, defined by who is looking at them and why.
And despite all our modern technology, constant surveillance, digital tracking, AI analysis, informants haven't gone away. Why do they persist?
Because technology still can't replicate the human element. A camera can record a meeting, a wiretap can capture words, data analysis can find patterns. But only a human informant can sit in that room, build trust, understand the nuances, interpret intentions, gauge emotions, report on whispered conversations or future plans that aren't captured electronically. As long as groups, whether criminal, terrorist, or even political dissenters, organize and communicate in secret, rely on personal trust networks, well, the opposing forces will always see the value in getting someone on the inside. Informants provide access and understanding that tech alone often can't. They remain an indispensable, if deeply problematic, tool in the intelligence and law enforcement arsenal.
So wrapping this all up, for more than 2 centuries, really, from stopping slave revolts way back when to navigating these complex modern geopolitical games, informants have been this constant, often invisible force shaping our world. Their impact is undeniable, it's profound, but the informants themselves, they remain these deeply ambiguous figures caught right at that intersection of morality and necessity.
Absolutely. And while you can argue about their necessity for security, for bringing down powerful criminals, the ethical compromises involved are just as undeniable. The potential for abuse, for betrayal, for the state itself becoming complicit in crime. It's always there. I think the ongoing challenge for societies, for governments, for law enforcement is how to strike that balance. How to use this powerful tool effectively when needed, but with rigorous oversight, strong ethical guardrails, and real accountability to prevent the kinds of abuses we've seen throughout history. It's about managing the risk inherent in dealing with betrayal and trying to maintain public trust in a world where secrets and lies are occupational hazards.
So as you, our listener, reflect on all this complex, often dark legacy of informants, especially thinking about their role in movements for liberation, for self-determination, where they were so often used as tools of suppression, but maybe sometimes also provided vital intelligence, here's something to consider. How do you weigh that cost? The cost of betrayal, the shattering of trust, the potential for abuse, against the perceived benefit of the information gained? Is the price ever too high? And looking forward, in our world of ever-increasing digital surveillance and transparency, what new forms might informant roles even take? Will technology change the game, or will the need for hidden human eyes and ears endure? And how will we, as societies, adapt to their persistent, shadowy presence?